The mist rolled off Blackwater Lake in thick, ghostly tendrils as I cast my line into the murky depths. The old-timers at the bait shop had warned me to stay away, muttering about curses and disappearances, but I dismissed their tales as nothing more than local legend. Fishing was my escape, my solace, and this lake, shrouded in eerie tranquility, promised a perfect day of solitude. The first tug on my line came unexpectedly, almost pulling the rod from my grasp. My heart raced with excitement as I began to reel it in, the line straining under the weight of whatever monstrous fish lurked beneath. But as the catch drew closer, a sense of unease washed over me. The water around my boat darkened, a shadow moving just below the surface, too large and too silent. With a final heave, I pulled my catch from the water, expecting to see a giant bass or catfish. Instead, my breath caught in my throat. What dangled from my hook was no ordinary fish but a grotesque, misshapen thing. Its eyes were bulging and lifeless, its mouth a twisted maw of sharp, broken teeth. The creature thrashed violently, emitting a high-pitched, almost human scream that chilled me to the bone. In a panic, I cut the line and watched as it sank back into the depths, its scream echoing in my ears long after it disappeared. Shaken, I decided to pack up and leave, but as I reached for the oars, I felt a cold, slimy hand wrap around my ankle. I yanked my foot back, nearly tipping the boat, but there was nothing there, just the ripple of water and my own mounting fear. I forced myself to calm down, attributing the sensation to my rattled nerves. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight, beneath the dark, placid surface. As I rowed back to shore, the fog thickened, enveloping me in a disorienting white haze. The familiar landmarks I used to navigate were obscured, and I found myself drifting, lost and alone in the mist. Hours seemed to pass, and the sky darkened, though it felt too soon for nightfall. I struggled to keep my bearings, my mind playing tricks on me, hearing whispers in the fog, seeing shapes moving just beyond my vision. I almost didn't notice when my boat finally scraped against the shore. Relieved, I jumped out, my boots sinking into the muddy bank. But this wasn't the spot where I had launched. The trees were gnarled and twisted, the air thick with a suffocating stench of decay. A sense of dread settled over me as I realized I had no idea where I was. I grabbed my gear and started walking, hoping to find a road or a familiar landmark. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees whispering in a language I couldn't understand. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal, just static and faint, ghostly voices. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had lost all meaning. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I began to see things moving in the shadows. Figures, human-like but wrong, with elongated limbs and hollow eyes, watching me, following me. Panic set in, and I started to run, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. I stumbled into a clearing and froze. There, in the center, was a small, dilapidated cabin. Light flickered from the windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Desperate for shelter, I approached, but every instinct screamed at me to turn back. Ignoring the warning, I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The air inside was stale, the floorboards rotting and covered in a thick layer of dust. The light came from a single, flickering candle on a rickety table. As I moved closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the table lay an old, leather-bound journal, open to a page filled with frantic, scrawled writing. The words were barely legible, but I could make out enough to understand that the journal belonged to another fisherman, someone who had come to Blackwater Lake years before. His entries detailed strange occurrences, sightings of the same grotesque creatures I had encountered. The final entry was a desperate plea for help, ending abruptly with a dark, rust-colored stain. A loud crash from behind made me spin around, my heart in my throat. The door had slammed shut, and standing in front of it was one of the figures from the forest, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I backed away, my mind racing for a way out, but the figure moved closer, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed the candle and hurled it at the figure. The flame caught its ragged clothing, and it let out a shriek of pain, but instead of burning, it dissolved into a black, oily smoke that filled the room. I coughed and choked, stumbling blindly until I found a window and smashed it open, clambering out into the cold night air. I ran, not knowing where I was going, just needing to get away from that cabin, from whatever haunted Blackwater Lake. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more frenzied, until I burst through the trees and found myself back at the water's edge. My boat was gone, and the lake was still and dark, a mirror reflecting the moonless sky. Exhausted and terrified, I fell to my knees, my mind unraveling. The last thing I remember is the water starting to ripple, the shadow of something enormous rising from the depths, and the feeling of cold, slimy hands pulling me under. When I woke up, I was lying on the shore, the sun rising over the lake. There was no sign of the creatures, the cabin, or even my boat. It was as if it had all been a nightmare, but the fear and the memory of those hollow eyes were all too real. I never went back to Blackwater Lake. I left town, moved far away, but the nightmares still haunt me. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, hearing those whispers, feeling those cold, slimy hands, and I know that whatever I encountered there, whatever lurks in the depths of Blackwater Lake, is still out there, waiting.